Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something that literally dominates our daily headlines, shapes global geopolitics, and honestly sparks incredibly intense debate. But instead of getting caught up in the incredibly fast-paced 24-hour news cycle, we're going to take a step back. We're going to visually map out a really fascinating historical analysis from our source text. It uses a unique framework to trace exactly how the United States and Israel relationship was constructed over decades, looking at the specific forces and major historical pivots that actually built the diplomatic landscape we're all living with today.
Right off the bat, let's ask a really fundamental question. How did a conditional partnership become an unconditional obligation? It gets straight to the heart of a modern paradox the author presents. Today, we're looking at a political environment where public critique of Israeli military operations, regardless of the scale or what the on-the-ground evidence shows, feels virtually impossible for American politicians. But the author argues that this huge distance between the relationship's origin and where it sits today isn't some big mystery. It's actually a meticulously constructed history. Understanding how a strategic partnership transformed into something that closely resembles a strict treaty obligation is, according to the text, the absolute bare minimum requirement for being able to examine it honestly.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. First up, the era of conditionality. Second, 1967, the strategic hinge. Third, building the unconditional. Fourth, trauma versus state policy. Fifth, the epistemic cost. And finally, pulling the historical thread.
Starting with Section 1, the era of conditionality.
Now, the author points out something that honestly might surprise a lot of observers today. Back in the late 40s and 50s, early CIA figures, guys like Kermit Roosevelt and Miles Copeland, were actually largely pro-Arab for Cold War strategic reasons. They viewed the newly formed State of Israel as a potential geopolitical liability in the whole contest for regional allegiance. And this created an era of genuine conditionality. For instance, while President Truman officially recognized Israel back in 1948, the relationship in its first decade was defined by real, heavily applied American leverage. During the 1956 Suez Crisis, President Eisenhower used intense financial and diplomatic pressure to successfully demand Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai. Fast forward a few years to 1963, and John F. Kennedy issued what basically amounted to near ultimatums to Israeli leadership, demanding biannual American inspections of their Dimona nuclear reactor. The author really asks us to sit with that for a second. Early American presidents applied massive leverage, and it actually produced results.
Which brings us to Section 2, 1967, the strategic hinge. So what's really interesting here is how dramatically everything shifted. Before 1967, the relationship was marked by that conditional leverage we just talked about. But the Six-Day War completely rewrote the geopolitical landscape. In just 6 days, Israel dismantled 3 Soviet-backed air forces. Overnight, and I mean literally overnight in the arithmetic of the Cold War, Israel's military performance transformed the nation into a massive, undeniable strategic asset for the United States. This huge convergence of interests provided the definitive argument for deepening military aid, intelligence sharing, and top-to-bottom political support.
Moving right along to Section 3, building the unconditional.
A shift of that magnitude, it doesn't just happen by accident. It requires real mechanics and infrastructure. The author details how the unconditional nature of this relationship was systematically constructed, step by step, into the very architecture of American foreign policy. A prime example of this new unconditional architecture is a concept called nuclear opacity. Following Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson essentially looked the other way regarding the Dimona reactor. The U.S. adopted an official policy of institutional amnesia. This formal posture of neither confirming nor denying Israel's nuclear capabilities, despite what U.S. intelligence agencies clearly already knew. As the text notes, this means the U.S. maintains a posture of quote-unquote not knowing about an arsenal of approximately 90 nuclear warheads that have never once been subject to International Atomic Energy Agency inspections. This, the author argues, is exactly what unconditional looks like when it's hardwired into the structure of a government.
And beyond the nuclear policy, the text maps out something it calls the ratchet effect. Following 1967, deepened military aid was coupled with growing entirely legitimate democratic lobbying efforts back in the U.S. But as these efforts succeeded, they created this massive compounding effect. Every single congressional vote in Israel's favor and every diplomatic veto at the United Nations established a stronger precedent. This created huge institutional momentum, bending the political environment so heavily that every subsequent dissenting vote became increasingly, sometimes ruinously costly for politicians. It made the whole relationship functionally unconditional.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds into the human element, trauma versus state policy.
Right here, the author transitions from the cold mechanics of foreign policy to the deeply emotional human core of their framework. It adds this incredibly vital layer of context to how these issues are actually internalized by people. The author shares a really striking piece of shoe leather journalism to illustrate this. A Jewish American California state senator was quoted saying, "That shit stays in the bones for generations." The context? While walking a parade route, the senator physically reacted to the presence of a German family nearby. Her nervous system, the author notes, wasn't being irrational at all. It was scanning for patterns that preceded historical harm. This powerfully demonstrates that the Jewish experience of persecution and intergenerational trauma is a physiological reality. It literally lives in the bones. It's a profound human fact, not just some political metaphor.
And this brilliantly illustrates the crucial intellectual move the author refers to as double vision. It's this idea that we absolutely must hold two realities at once. On one hand, you have the incredibly valid ancestral trauma of the Jewish people. On the other hand, you have the institutional policies of the Israeli state, things like settlement expansion, military operations, or the siege of Gaza. The author argues that separating these two things is not an act of prejudice. Actually, scratch that. It's more like the absolute minimum requirement for honest political analysis. Acknowledging genuine human trauma while simultaneously retaining the right to critique state policy is the cognitive double vision required to even begin to understand this topic.
That leads us into section 5, the epistemic cost.
So what is the true cost of an unconditional relationship? The author says it's epistemic, meaning it degrades how we know what we know. When asking totally basic questions about whether a foreign policy relationship actually serves strategic interests, gets treated as a form of betrayal, rather than just a standard, boring function of governance, we lose vital historical context. The author points out that this kind of environment systematically scrubs our public conversations of the very history we desperately need to make informed, democratic decisions about war and peace.
Which brings us to our final section, pulling the historical thread. So the crucial point here is that this loss of historical memory isn't just a fun debate for academics. It is directly impacting the world right this very second. The author argues that a hypothetical 2026 US-Iran shooting war wouldn't just spontaneously drop out of the sky. It would be the result of an accumulation of historical weight. We can actually trace the thread all the way from the 1953 CIA coup in Iran, right through the 1979 hostage crisis, through decades of tense nuclear standoffs, and through the 2020 Abraham Accords, which bypassed the Palestinian question. Each one of these steps, presented to the public without that full historical context we just talked about, built upon the last one, steadily ratcheting up the tension to a total boiling point.
Now, to be completely clear, the author doesn't argue that the US-Israel relationship shouldn't exist, and they definitely don't deny that Israel's security is a legitimate interest. Instead, the core argument is that a relationship this consequential to global stability demands rigorous, honest examination. Understanding it requires deliberately separating human history from state policy. The thread of history is still running today, and the text leaves us with this incredible, heavy question to ponder. Do we actually have the capacity to honestly examine this deeply complex relationship before that thread finally snaps? It is a powerful framework, and it really asks us to look closely at the architecture of the world we're living in right now.